The rain was falling hard that evening in San Francisco, relentless, cold, and unforgiving. But no one noticed the trembling man standing on the slick pavement of California Street. His eyes were fixed on the storm drain at his feet, but the world around him was frozen, silent, and empty. Behind him, the ghost of ticking clocks seemed to haunt an empty chair waiting in a cold mansion far above the city, where time itself had stopped for a man named Charles Whitman, a millionaire who had lost everything but his money. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're looking at an old photograph or remembering someone you once loved and can't quite reach anymore. It doesn't matter what time it is. But I promise, today's story will touch your soul. The storm drains of San Francisco have swallowed countless secrets over the decades, but that night something different was about to emerge from the darkness. Charles stood there, his Italian leather shoes soaking through, his tailored coat no protection against the emotional storm raging inside him. The city's financial district stretched behind him like a cathedral of glass and steel, monuments to the kind of success that had once defined his entire existence. But success, he had learned, could be the cruelest prison of all. 10 months had passed since Marianne's funeral. 10 months since the last genuine smile had crossed his face. 10 months since he had felt anything other than the hollow ache that had become his constant companion. The rain pounded against the pavement with the same relentless rhythm as his guilt, each drop a reminder of all the moments he had spent building his empire instead of holding his wife's hand. The irony wasn't lost on him, a man who had built his fortune on predicting market trends, on reading the future in numbers and algorithms, had been completely blindsided by the one variable he couldn't calculate: how quickly love could be stolen away. The sound of small bare feet splashing through puddles cut through his brooding like a knife through silk. Charles looked up to see a little girl running toward him, her dark hair plastered against her face, her worn sneakers squelching with each desperate step. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but her eyes held a gravity that seemed to span decades. When she reached him, she grabbed his sleeve with small, surprisingly strong fingers and looked up at him with an urgency that stopped his breath. "Help me!" she gasped, pointing to the storm drain. "He's alive down there." Charles Whitman had built his vast fortune through calculated risks and cold logic, transforming a modest inheritance into a technology empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His investments in artificial intelligence, cryptocurrency portfolios worth more than most people's houses, and his diversified asset management had made him one of San Francisco's most influential figures. The penthouse that crowned the Whitman Tower wasn't just a home, it was a testament to what money could buy. Imported marble from Carrara, handcrafted furniture from Milan, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Bay Area's sprawling wealth. But wealth, Charles had discovered, was a peculiar thing. It could purchase luxury beyond imagination, yet it couldn't buy back a single moment with the woman he had loved more than life itself. His net worth, calculated down to the last dividend payment and Bitcoin fluctuation, meant nothing when measured against the silence that now filled his days. The stock options that had once excited him, the business deals that had once driven him, the profit margins that had once kept him awake at night, all of it felt like elaborate games played by a man he no longer recognized. The mansion that had once hosted elaborate charity galas and business dinners now stood as empty as a mausoleum. The dining room table, crafted from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood and worth more than most people's annual salaries, hadn't seen a meal in months. The kitchen, equipped with restaurant-grade appliances that had cost more than a luxury car, remained pristine and unused. Charles survived on takeout and whiskey, eating mechanically while staring at financial reports that no longer held any meaning. Every room in the house held memories of Marianne, the library where she had curled up with her novels while he worked on his laptop, analyzing market trends and cryptocurrency charts. The garden terrace where she had grown her roses while he conducted conference calls about stock portfolios and investment opportunities. The master bedroom where they had planned their future, dreaming of children who would inherit not just his fortune, but their love. Now those rooms felt like shrines to a life that had been cut short, filled with furniture worth millions, but devoid of any warmth. The doctors had explained Mary Ann's illness in terms he understood: statistics, percentages, survival rates. But they couldn't quantify the way her laugh had filled their home, or the gentle way she had teased him about his obsession with profit margins and capital gains. They couldn't measure the value of her presence at dinner parties, how she had made their guests feel welcomed while he discussed dividends and market volatility. When she died, Charles realized that all his financial acumen, all his ability to read market trends and predict economic futures, had been useless in the face of the one investment that truly mattered: the time he hadn't spent with her. The clocks in the mansion had stopped ticking the night she died, and Charles had left them that way. Time, like everything else in his life, had become frozen at the moment he lost her. His personal assistant handled his business affairs now, managing his stock options and cryptocurrency investments while he wandered through his empty palace like a ghost. The fortune continued to grow, dividends rolled in, his portfolio expanded, his net worth increased, but Charles felt poorer than he ever had in his life. Maya appeared in his world like a small miracle wrapped in torn sneakers and a faded pink jacket. She lived in the Tenderloin, a neighborhood that existed in sharp contrast to Charles's gilded world. While he lived among marble and gold, Maya's world was painted in the vibrant colors of survival: the neon signs of corner stores, the rainbow murals on brick walls, the colorful laundry hanging from fire escapes like flags of hope. Her mother, Maria, worked double shifts at a diner called Rosa's, serving coffee and comfort food to cab drivers, night shift workers, and anyone else who needed a warm meal and a friendly smile. Maya's apartment was small enough to fit inside Charles's walk-in closet, but it pulsed with life in ways his mansion never had. The walls were covered with her drawings, crayon sketches of flowers, angels, and families holding hands under bright yellow suns. The furniture was second-hand and mismatched, but each piece told a story of love and resourcefulness. A couch covered with a handmade quilt, a kitchen table painted bright blue to hide its scratches, shelves made from planks and bricks filled with library books and small treasures Maya had collected from the streets. Maria worked hard to provide for her daughter, but there was little left over for luxuries. Maya's clothes came from thrift stores and church donations, her toys were homemade or rescued from garage sales, and her treats were dollar store candy shared with friends in the neighborhood playground. Yet Maya carried herself with a richness that had nothing to do with money. She knew every stray dog within 6 blocks, could coax birds to eat from her hands, and had a way of making people smile even on their worst days. The night she met Charles, Maya had been walking home from the library, her backpack heavy with picture books about faraway places and magical adventures. She had taken shelter under the awning of a closed shop when she heard the faint whimpering coming from the storm drain. While other adults hurried past, their umbrellas bent against the wind, Maya had stopped to listen. Something in that sound spoke to her heart, the same way her mother's tired sighs spoke to her, or the way her neighbor's lonely humming drifted through thin walls. When she saw Charles standing there, staring into the storm drain as if he were looking into an abyss, Maya recognized something familiar in his posture. He looked the way her mother looked sometimes after particularly difficult days, like someone carrying a weight too heavy for one person to bear. Maya had learned early in life that adults often forgot how to ask for help, so she had decided to ask for him. "Help me," she said again, her small voice cutting through the rain's white noise. "He's alive down there." Charles looked down at her with the expression of a man being awakened from a dream. His first instinct was irritation. What was a child doing out alone in this weather? Where were her parents? But something in her eyes gave him pause. They weren't the eyes of someone seeking attention or playing games. They were the eyes of someone who had seen something that mattered. Charles stared at the little girl standing before him, water dripping from her hair like tiny diamonds in the streetlight. His immediate reaction was skepticism mixed with annoyance. He was a man of science and logic, someone who dealt in facts, figures, and cold hard reality. His fortune had been built on his ability to see through emotional appeals and focus on what was real, what was profitable, what made sense. Children, in his limited experience, were creatures of imagination and fantasy, prone to seeing unicorns in cloud formations and hearing music in the wind. "There's nothing down there but rats and garbage," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. The rain was soaking through his expensive coat, and all he wanted was to get back to his warm, empty penthouse where he could nurse his grief in private. "You shouldn't be out here alone, kid. Where are your parents?" But Maya didn't flinch at his tone. Instead, she knelt down beside the storm drain, her small face serious and focused. She pressed her ear to the metal grating, listening intently to something Charles couldn't hear over the storm's chaos. Then, without hesitation, she began trying to lift the heavy cover with her small hands. "He's scared," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "He's been calling for help, but nobody stops to listen." Charles watched in disbelief as the child struggled with the drain cover. Part of him wanted to walk away, to dismiss this as the fantasy of an overly imaginative child. But something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the absolute certainty in her voice, or the way she worked with such determination despite her small size. Or maybe it was simply that he hadn't felt curious about anything in months, and this strange little girl had managed to penetrate the fog of his indifference. Against his better judgment, Charles found himself kneeling beside Maya. His hands, soft from years of office work, but still strong, easily lifted the storm drain cover that had been too heavy for her. The smell that rose from the darkness was unpleasant, a mixture of rainwater, decay, and urban runoff. But underneath it all, Charles heard what Maya had heard, a faint whimpering, barely audible above the sound of rushing water. "See?" Maya said, as if she had just proven the existence of gravity. She reached into the drain without hesitation, her small arm disappearing into the darkness. When she pulled back, she held a tiny, soaked puppy that couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Its fur was matted and dirty, its eyes barely open, but it was unmistakably alive. Charles stared at the small miracle in Maya's hands. His rational mind immediately began calculating probabilities. How had the puppy gotten into the drain? How had it survived? How had this child known it was there? But for once, his analytical nature was overshadowed by something else. Wonder. It had been so long since he had witnessed anything that couldn't be explained by spreadsheets and market analysis that the simple reality of this moment felt almost supernatural. Maya cradled the puppy against her chest, her jacket creating a small shelter from the rain. "Sometimes," she said, looking up at Charles with eyes that seemed too wise for her age, "God wears the face of a child. My mama says that when we help the smallest and weakest, we're really helping angels in disguise." The words hit Charles like a physical blow. He had heard similar sentiments before, usually in the charity galas he had attended for tax purposes, but hearing them from this child, in this moment, gave them a weight they had never carried before. He looked at Maya, really looked at her, and saw something that made his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. This little girl, who clearly had so little in terms of material wealth, had stopped everything to save a creature even smaller and more vulnerable than herself. As they stood together in the rain, the rescued puppy whimpering softly in Maya's arms, Charles felt something shift inside him. It was subtle, like the first crack in a dam, barely noticeable, but somehow significant. For the first time in 10 months, he was thinking about something other than his own pain. For the first time since Marianne's death, he was seeing something other than the endless gray landscape of his grief. In the days that followed their first encounter, Maya began appearing in Charles's life with a frequency that seemed both coincidental and destined. She would be sitting on the bench outside his favorite coffee shop when he emerged from business meetings, sketching pictures of flowers in a worn notebook. She'd be feeding pigeons in the small park where he sometimes walked when the walls of his penthouse felt too confining. She'd be helping an elderly man cross the street just as Charles's car stopped at the intersection, her small hand guiding him with the patience of someone 3 times her age. Each time, Charles found excuses to dismiss these encounters as mere coincidence. San Francisco was a big city, but not so big that the same two people couldn't cross paths regularly. There was nothing magical or meaningful about it, just the statistical probability of two people who lived in the same general area encountering each other. He was a man who understood numbers, who could calculate risk and probability with mathematical precision. What he was experiencing was simply the human brain's tendency to find patterns where none existed. But the puppy thrived. Maya had taken it home to her small apartment, where her mother had initially protested about another mouth to feed. But Maya had insisted, in the way that only children can, that the puppy was meant to be part of their family. She named him Hope, and somehow managed to care for him despite having no money for veterinary bills or fancy pet food. She fed him scraps from her own meals, made him a bed from old towels, and taught him tricks using patience and love instead of expensive training techniques. When Charles happened to see them together during one of their chance encounters, he was struck by the transformation in the small animal. The pitiful, half-drowned creature from the storm drain had become a bright-eyed, energetic puppy who followed Maya everywhere with devoted loyalty. It should have been impossible. Puppies that young needed specialized care, expensive medical attention, the kind of resources Maya's family simply didn't have. Yet here was living proof that love could sometimes accomplish what money could not. "How did you know?" Charles asked her one afternoon, when he found Maya sitting in the park with Hope playing at her feet. "How did you know the puppy was in there?" Maya looked up from the daisy chain she was making, her expression serious and thoughtful. "I listened," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Most people forget how to really listen, because their heads are too full of noise. But if you make your heart quiet, you can hear things that need help. The simplicity of her answer frustrated Charles. He was accustomed to complex explanations, detailed analysis, multivariable calculations. Maya's worldview seemed to operate on principles that defied his understanding of how things worked. Yet he couldn't argue with the results. She had saved a life that night, using nothing more than her willingness to pay attention to what others ignored. As the weeks passed, Charles found himself looking forward to these unexpected encounters. Maya never asked him for anything. No money, no favors, no solutions to her family's obvious financial struggles. She simply accepted his presence in her orbit with the same natural ease with which she accepted everything else in her life. She would tell him stories about the people in her neighborhood, about the lady who ran the corner store and always saved day-old pastries for children who counted their pennies, about the man who played guitar on street corners and knew songs in 7 different languages. Through Maya's eyes, Charles began to see a version of San Francisco he had never noticed before. While he had always moved through the city in climate-controlled cars and glass elevators, Maya walked its streets and breathed its air. She knew which food trucks served the best tacos, which murals had been painted by local artists, which corners offered the best views of the sunset over the bay. Her world was smaller in terms of geography and resources, but infinitely richer in human connection and simple joy. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Charles's penthouse began to change. One morning he opened the blinds that had been closed since Marianne's death, letting natural light flood into rooms that had been artificially lit for months. The sudden brightness revealed how dusty and lifeless his palace had become, but instead of closing the blinds again, he found himself opening windows to let in fresh air. The sounds of the city, traffic, construction, distant music, human voices, flowed into his home like a river returning to a dried riverbed. The clocks remained stopped, but Charles noticed that he had begun to measure time differently. Instead of marking days by stock market openings and dividend payments, he found himself aware of when Maya might be walking home from school, or when she usually fed the pigeons in the park. His calendar, once packed with board meetings and investment consultations, began to show small gaps of free time that he used for brief walks in the neighborhood. One evening, as Charles stood in his living room watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of gold and pink, he realized that Maya had accomplished something. His therapists, his business associates, and his financial advisors had all failed to achieve. She had reminded him that the world outside his grief was still turning, still beautiful, still worthy of attention. It wasn't that his pain had disappeared. The ache of missing Marianne was still there, as sharp as ever. But now it coexisted with other feelings: curiosity, protectiveness, and something that might have been the beginning of hope. The bond between Charles and Maya deepened gradually, built on small moments and quiet conversations that seemed to happen outside the normal flow of time. Maya had a way of asking questions that cut straight to the heart of things, bypassing the elaborate defenses Charles had built around his emotions. She never demanded answers, but her mere presence seemed to invite honesty in a way that made pretense impossible. "Why don't you smile any more?" she asked him one afternoon, as they sat together on a bench watching Hope chase pigeons with enthusiastic futility. The question came without preamble, delivered in the matter-of-fact way children have of addressing the world's mysteries. Charles felt his throat tighten. No one had asked him that question directly, though he was sure people had noticed. In business meetings, his serious demeanor was attributed to focus and professional intensity. At social gatherings he still occasionally attended, people assumed he was simply becoming more distinguished with age. But Maya saw what others pretended not to see: that his face had forgotten how to express joy. "I lost someone very important to me," he said, the words coming easier than he expected. "My wife, Marianne. She died, and I don't know how to be happy anymore." Maya nodded solemnly, as if she understood loss in ways that seemed impossible for someone her age. "My papa died when I was little," she said quietly. Mama cried for a long time. She said it felt like someone had stolen all the colors from the world and left everything gray. Charles looked at this small girl with new understanding. He had assumed her natural optimism came from inexperience, from a life that hadn't yet taught her about real pain. But he was wrong. Maya knew about loss, about the way grief could drain meaning from everything that used to bring pleasure. The difference was that she had found her way back to color again. "How did your mama start smiling again?" Charles asked. She said she realized that Papa wouldn't want her to stop living just because he had to stop. So she started doing little things, like making my favorite breakfast or singing while she cleaned. Not because she felt happy, but because she wanted to honor the love they had by not wasting the life he had given her. Maya's words settled into Charles's chest like seeds finding fertile ground. He thought about Marianne, about the way she had lived with such enthusiasm and warmth. She had loved dinner parties because she enjoyed bringing people together. She had loved their travels because she found wonder in new experiences. She had loved their quiet evenings at home because she believed that ordinary moments could be sacred if you paid attention to them. What would Marianne think of the way he was living now? Would she recognize the man who had locked himself away from everything that had once brought them both joy? Charles knew, with painful clarity, that his wife would be heartbroken to see him wasting the life they had built together, squandering the fortune they had accumulated not for its own sake, but for the freedom and security it could provide. "Maya," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion, "do you believe in God?" The question surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Charles had never been particularly religious, and Marianne's illness had destroyed whatever faith he might have had in benevolent divine intervention. But something about Maya's presence in his life felt larger than coincidence, more purposeful than random chance. "I believe in love," Maya said simply. "Mama says God is just another name for the love that connects everything together. She says when we love each other, especially when it's hard, we're doing God's work in the world." Over the following weeks, Maya began visiting Charles more regularly, though these meetings still maintained the quality of happy accidents rather than planned appointments. She would appear at his office building after school, having walked the considerable distance from her neighborhood to his, claiming she was just exploring. She'd be sitting in the lobby of his apartment building when he returned from late business dinners, reading a library book while the security guard pretended not to notice she didn't belong there. Charles found himself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation he hadn't felt in months. Maya brought stories from her world, tales of neighborhood characters, small adventures, observations about life that consistently surprised him with their insight. She told him about Mrs. Chen, who ran the corner grocery store and spoke to her plants in Chinese because she believed it helped them grow. She described the murals being painted on the side of the community center, collaborations between local artists and children that transformed blank walls into celebrations of culture and hope. In return, Charles began sharing memories of Marianne, stories he hadn't told anyone since her death. He told Maya about their first date, how nervous he had been, and how Marianne had put him at ease with her laughter. He described their wedding day, smaller and more intimate than their wealth might have suggested, because Marianne preferred meaningful moments to expensive spectacle. He talked about their dreams of having children, about the room they had prepared but never filled, about the plans they had made for growing old together. Maya listened to these stories with the same serious attention she gave to everything else, asking questions that revealed her remarkable capacity for empathy. She never tried to minimize his grief or rush him toward healing, but her presence made the memories less painful somehow. Speaking about Marianne to Maya felt like sharing his wife with someone who would have loved her, who would have understood why her loss left such an enormous crater in his world. One rainy evening, as Maya sat in Charles's penthouse for the first time, she had followed him home from the office, appearing at his door with Hope tucked inside her jacket. She noticed the stopped clocks scattered throughout the rooms. She walked from room to room, examining each frozen timepiece with the curiosity of an archaeologist discovering ancient artifacts. Time stopped when she died, Charles explained, feeling self-conscious about the obvious symbolism of his gesture. Maya nodded thoughtfully, then walked to the grandfather clock that dominated the living room. She studied its ornate face, its motionless hands pointing to 11:47, the exact time Marianne had drawn her last breath. "Time doesn't really stop, though," Maya said gently. "It just keeps going invisible, like underground rivers. Maybe the clocks are waiting for you to be ready to see time again." That night, for the first time since Marianne's death, Charles prayed. It wasn't the formal prayer of organized religion, but something more personal and desperate. He asked whatever force had brought Maya into his life to help him find his way back to the land of the living. He prayed for the strength to honor Marianne's memory by not wasting the years he had left. And he prayed for the wisdom to understand what a little girl with nothing but love in her heart was trying to teach him about the nature of miracles. The fragile peace that had begun to grow in Charles's world shattered on a Thursday afternoon when Maria, Maya's mother, appeared at his office building with the fierce determination of a woman protecting her child. Charles was in the lobby, having just finished a meeting with his investment advisors about diversifying his cryptocurrency portfolio, when he saw a woman who looked like an older version of Maya striding toward him with unmistakable purpose. Maria was tired in the way that only single mothers working multiple jobs can be tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that showed in her posture, her expression, and the careful way she moved as if conserving energy for the battles that mattered most. Her work uniform from Rosa's diner still carried the scents of coffee and bacon grease, and her hands showed the calluses and small burns that came from years of serving others, but her eyes burned with protective fire. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had fought for everything she had ever gained. "We need to talk." Charles knew immediately what this was about, and his heart sank. He had been waiting for this moment, dreading it even as he had been unable to prevent it. Maya hadn't told her mother about their friendship, but children were not skilled at keeping secrets, and a little girl who suddenly came home with stories about a rich man who lived in a tower was bound to raise questions. They found a quiet corner of the lobby, away from the flow of business people and delivery personnel who moved through the space with the efficient purposelessness of urban life. Maria's presence felt like an accusation, though Charles knew he had done nothing inappropriate. Still, he could see how their relationship might look from the outside, a wealthy, grieving man forming an attachment to a child from a poor family. The implications were obvious and troubling. "Maya talks about you." Maria said, her tone carefully controlled. She says you're sad like I was after her father died. She says you need help, like the puppy needed help. Charles felt a flush of shame at the comparison. Was that how Maya saw him? As another broken creature to be rescued from the metaphorical storm drain of his grief? The thought was both humbling and painful. She's a remarkable child, Charles said, choosing his words carefully. She has a gift for seeing what others miss. I never sought out her friendship, Mrs. Martinez, but I've been grateful for her kindness during a difficult time in my life. Maria studied his face with the suspicious expertise of someone who had learned to read people quickly and accurately. In her line of work, she encountered all types: businessmen, laborers, drifters, locals, tourists, and she had developed an instinct for distinguishing between those who could be trusted and those who couldn't. I know who you are, she said. I looked you up online. Whitman Technologies, net worth in the hundreds of millions, lost your wife last year. I'm sorry for your loss, I truly am, but Maya is not your charity project, and she's not your emotional support animal. The bluntness of her words stung because they contained a grain of truth Charles didn't want to acknowledge. Had he been using Maya's friendship as a form of therapy? Was his growing attachment to her a healthy connection or a selfish attempt to fill the void Marianne had left behind? You're right to be protective of her, Charles said. If I had a daughter, I would feel the same way. But I want you to know that I have never and would never do anything to harm Maya. She's been a light in a very dark time, and I hope I've been a friend to her as well. Maria's expression softened slightly, but her posture remained defensive. Maya doesn't understand the world the way adults do. She sees good in everyone because she hasn't learned to be afraid yet. But I've spent 8 years making sure she stays safe, and I won't let anyone, even someone with good intentions, put her at risk. What kind of risk do you think I pose? Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. You live in a different world than we do, Maria said, gesturing toward the marble and glass that surrounded them. When Maya talks about you, she lights up like you're some kind of fairy godfather. But what happens when you get tired of playing with your little poor friend? What happens when you move on with your life and she's left wondering why someone she trusted just disappeared? The question hit Charles like a physical blow because it forced him to confront something he had been avoiding. What was his intention with Maya? Was this friendship just a temporary salve for his grief, something he would outgrow as he healed? Or was he prepared to make a lasting commitment to being part of her life? I hadn't thought that far ahead, Charles admitted. I've been living day to day since my wife died. Maya helped me remember that tomorrow might be worth seeing. But you're right. She deserves better than uncertainty from the adults in her life. Maria seemed surprised by his honesty. She had probably expected defensiveness or anger, not this vulnerable admission of his own confusion. For a moment, her protective armor cracked enough to reveal the exhaustion underneath. She talks about you like you hung the moon, Maria said quietly. She says you listen to her stories and ask questions like they matter. Most adults just smile and nod when kids talk, but she says you really hear her. Do you know how rare that is? Charles thought about his conversations with Maya, about the way she shared her observations about the world with such enthusiasm and trust. He had been listening, really listening, because her perspectives consistently surprised him. In a life that had become predictable and gray, Maya's way of seeing things had introduced color and possibility. She's taught me more than I've taught her, Charles said. She's helped me remember what wonder feels like, what hope looks like. I know that might sound selfish, but I think we've helped each other. Maria was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to read his soul. Maya's father died in a construction accident when she was 3, she said finally. She doesn't remember him much, but she remembers the sadness that came after. She says you have the same sadness, but you're trying to find your way out like I did. The parallel between their losses wasn't lost on Charles. Both he and Maria had lost spouses unexpectedly. Both had been left to navigate grief alone. The difference was that Maria had a child depending on her. forcing her to function, to survive, to eventually heal. Charles had only had his money and his emptiness. "Maybe," Maria said, her voice softer now, "Maya needs to see that sadness doesn't have to be forever. Maybe she needs to see someone learning to live again. But if you're going to be part of her life, you better be sure you're in it for keeps. She's lost enough people already." The conversation ended with an uneasy truce rather than a resolution. Maria didn't forbid Maya from seeing Charles, but her warning was clear. He needed to decide what kind of role he was prepared to play in the child's life. For Maya's sake, he couldn't be merely a temporary distraction from his grief. He had to be willing to commit to being a consistent, positive presence, or he needed to step away before her attachment to him deepened further. That evening, Charles sat in his penthouse surrounded by the physical evidence of his wealth, art worth more than most people's homes, furniture crafted by master artisans, technology that could connect him to markets around the world, and felt poorer than he had ever felt in his life. Maya's friendship had awakened something in him, a capacity for caring that he thought had died with Marianne. But Maria's words forced him to confront the responsibilities that came with that awakening. For the first time in months, Charles found himself thinking seriously about the future, not just the next board meeting or quarterly report, but the shape of the life he wanted to build in the years ahead. Maya had shown him that healing was possible, but healing required more than just the passage of time. It required choice, commitment, and the courage to love again despite the risk of loss. 3 days passed without Maya appearing in any of her usual places. Charles found himself walking past the park where she usually fed pigeons, lingering outside the library where she spent her afternoons, even driving slowly through her neighborhood, though he knew he had no right to seek her out at home. The silence felt familiar but more painful now, like a preview of the emptiness that would return if their friendship ended. On the 4th day, Charles received a phone call that changed everything. Maria's voice on the other end was tight with controlled panic, stripped of the defensive anger from their previous conversation and replaced by raw maternal fear. "Maya's in the hospital," she said without preamble. "She has pneumonia. It developed fast, and she's not responding to the medication the way they hoped. I know what I said before, but she keeps asking for you. She says you understand about being scared and lonely." Charles didn't remember hanging up the phone or grabbing his keys. He didn't remember the drive to San Francisco General Hospital or the maze of corridors he navigated to find the pediatric ward. What he remembered was the moment he saw Maya in that hospital bed, looking impossibly small against the white sheets, her breathing assisted by machines that beeped with mechanical precision. Maya's face was flushed with fever, her dark hair damp with perspiration, but her eyes lit up when she saw him enter the room. "You came," she whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with relief. "I was hoping you would come." Charles sat beside her bed, taking her small hand in his larger one, and felt something break open inside his chest. This child, this beautiful, wise, generous child who had asked for nothing but his attention, was fighting for her life. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had spent months wishing he could join his wife in death was now praying desperately for a little girl to live. "I'm right here," he told her, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere." Maya smiled, a weak but genuine expression that seemed to light up the sterile hospital room. "Mama says sometimes God tests our faith by making us wait for miracles. But I think maybe the miracle isn't always getting what we want. Maybe sometimes the miracle is just knowing someone cares enough to stay with us while we wait." As Charles held Maya's hand through the long night that followed, he realized that Maria had been right to challenge him. This was what commitment looked like. Not the easy companionship of good times, but the fierce loyalty of staying present through fear and uncertainty. Maya had given him the gift of hope during his darkest period, and now it was his turn to offer her the steady presence of someone who would not leave. The fever broke just before dawn, and Maya's breathing eased as the medication finally began to take effect. But Charles remained at her bedside, unwilling to trust that the crisis had truly passed. He thought about all the moments he had missed with Marianne, all the times he had chosen work over presence, profit over connection. He had been given a second chance to love someone fully, and he wasn't going to waste it on the assumption that there would always be more time. When Maya woke up the following afternoon, clear-eyed and breathing freely, she found Charles still there, his expensive suit wrinkled from sleeping in the hospital chair, his usually perfect hair disheveled, but his face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for months. "Did you stay all night?" she asked. "I made a promise," Charles replied, "and I keep my promises." Maya studied his face with the serious attention she gave to all important matters. "Good," she said finally. "Promises are the most important things we have. They're how we tell people they matter enough to count on us." In that moment, Charles understood that Maya hadn't just saved a puppy from a storm drain or helped a grieving man remember how to live. She had taught him the difference between existing and belonging, between having everything and having something worth having. She had shown him that love required more than feeling. It required action, presence, and the willingness to show up even when showing up was difficult. The miracle Charles had been waiting for didn't come in a flash of divine light or supernatural healing. It came in the slow recognition that he was no longer the same man who had stood in the rain 10 months earlier, wishing the storm drain would swallow him whole. Maya had pulled him back into the world of the living, one small act of kindness at a time, until caring about her future became more important than mourning his past. The morning Maya was discharged from the hospital, she handed Charles a folded piece of paper that had been tucked under her pillow. It was a drawing she had made during one of the long, fever-hazed nights. A picture of him and Marianne standing together, both of them smiling, surrounded by golden light. At the bottom, written in her careful 8-year-old handwriting, were the words, "She wants you to be happy again." Charles stared at the drawing for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. He had never described Marianne's appearance to Maya in detail, yet the figure in the drawing captured something essential about his wife, not just her physical features, but the warmth and joy she had brought to every room she entered. It was as if Maya had somehow seen Marianne through Charles's memories and love. "How did you know what she looked like?" Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya smiled, that same mysterious expression she wore whenever she revealed one of her small wisdoms. "Sometimes when people love each other very much, the love stays behind even after they have to go away. I can see the love around you, like light, and it has her shape." The words should have sounded like childish fantasy, but coming from Maya, they felt like profound truth. Charles realized that this little girl who had rescued a dying puppy from a storm drain had somehow also rescued his capacity to believe in things beyond logic and profit margins. She had taught him that love was not diminished by death, but transformed, not ended, but redirected toward new purposes and connections. Over the following weeks, as Maya recovered her strength and returned to school, Charles began to channel his profound gratitude into action. His fortune, which had felt like a burden since Marianne's death, suddenly had purpose again. He established the Marianne Whitman Foundation, dedicated to supporting families in crisis, children's health care, and educational programs in underserved neighborhoods. But unlike the impersonal charity work he had done in the past, writing checks and attending galas for tax benefits, this foundation was built on the principles Maya had taught him about really seeing people who needed help. He visited the programs he funded, learned the names of the children who benefited from his support, and made himself available not just as a benefactor, but as someone who cared about outcomes. The Foundation's first major project was a partnership with Rosa's Diner to provide free meals for families facing medical emergencies. Maria, despite her initial skepticism about Charles's motives, found herself working closely with him to design programs that addressed real needs rather than donor ego. Together, they created support systems for single parents dealing with illness, scholarship funds for children showing academic promise despite economic challenges, and emergency assistance for families facing eviction or utility shutoffs. Charles's business associates noticed the change in him immediately. The man who had become increasingly distant and disengaged since his wife's death was suddenly energized by projects that had nothing to do with profit margins or stock performance. Board meetings that used to focus exclusively on maximizing shareholder value now included discussions about corporate social responsibility and community investment. Some of his investors were concerned about this shift in priorities, worrying that Charles was allowing emotion to cloud his business judgment. But Charles had learned something that Maya understood intuitively, that money was only valuable when it was used to create connection, to solve problems, to make life better for people who needed help. His wealth had not decreased. In fact, his focused approach to business, combined with his renewed sense of purpose, had made his companies more successful than ever. But success now meant something different than it had before. The penthouse that had felt like a mausoleum was gradually transformed into a home again. Charles didn't change everything. Marianne's favorite chair remained in its place, and their bedroom stayed exactly as she had left it. But he opened the blinds permanently, allowing natural light to flood the spaces that had been artificially lit for months. He started the stopped clocks, not because he wanted to forget Marianne, but because he wanted to honor her by not wasting the time he had been given. Maya visited regularly now, with Maria's blessing and active encouragement. She would arrive after school with Hope trotting beside her, filling Charles's sterile home with the sound of laughter and the controlled chaos that children bring to adult spaces. Maya would do her homework at his kitchen table while Charles worked on foundation business nearby, both of them comfortable in each other's presence. Sometimes Maya would tell Charles stories about her day, about the new student in her class who spoke only Spanish, about the stray cat that had adopted the playground, about the elderly man who played chess in the park and was teaching her the game. Other times, they would work on projects together, Maya helping to sort through applications for foundation grants, Charles helping with her school assignments that required research or math skills beyond her grade level. These quiet domestic moments felt sacred to Charles in ways that his previous life of luxury never had. When Maya curled up in Marianne's chair to read while Charles reviewed financial documents, he could almost feel his wife's approval, as if she were pleased to see her favorite space filled with life and purpose again. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the Bay Area in shades of gold and pink, Maya made an observation that captured everything Charles had been learning about the nature of healing and hope. "I think sadness and happiness can live in the same heart," she said, her young face serious with concentration. "Like how flowers can grow in a garden even when there are weeds. The weeds don't stop the flowers from being beautiful, and the flowers don't make the weeds disappear. They just both live there together." Charles looked at this remarkable child who had somehow managed to articulate the complex emotional truth he had been struggling to understand. His grief for Marianne would always be part of him, but it no longer had to define him. Maya had shown him that the heart was capacious enough to hold both sorrow and joy, both loss and new love. "Maya," Charles said, his voice filled with wonder at her wisdom, "how did you get so smart about feelings?" Maya considered the question seriously, as she did all questions. "I think when your heart gets broken, it learns how to see other broken hearts. And when you know what it feels like to need help, you get better at knowing when other people need help too. Maybe that's why God sends us sad times, so we can learn how to help each other feel less alone." That night, for the first time since Marianne's death, Charles fell asleep easily, without the aid of sleeping pills or whiskey. He slept deeply and dreamlessly, waking with a sense of peace he had forgotten was possible. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer felt like a weight trying to pull him underwater. Instead, it felt like depth, like wisdom, like the foundation upon which a new kind of happiness could be built. 2 years after that rainy night when Maya first appeared in Charles's life, the transformation was complete but ongoing. The Marianne Whitman Foundation had grown into one of the most effective philanthropic organizations in the Bay Area, known not just for the size of its donations, but for the personal attention and care with which its programs were designed and implemented. Charles had learned to navigate board meetings and investment consultations with renewed focus, but his definition of success had been fundamentally altered. Quarterly profits still mattered, but they mattered because they funded programs that changed lives. Stock performance was still important, but it was important because it meant more children would have access to health care, more families would receive help during emergencies, more communities would have resources for education and support. Maya, now 10 years old and even wiser than her years should have allowed, had become something like an unofficial advisor for the foundation. Her insights about what children and families actually needed, as opposed to what adults thought they needed, had improved every program the foundation supported. She had a gift for asking simple questions that revealed complex problems, for seeing solutions that adults missed because they were thinking too hard about logistics and not hard enough about human nature. The relationship between Charles and Maya had evolved into something that resembled family more than friendship. Charles had become a reliable presence in her life, attending school plays and science fairs, helping with homework and offering guidance about everything from friendship drama to career aspirations. Maya had introduced him to her extended community, her teachers, her neighbors, her mother's friends, and he had been accepted into that world with the kind of warmth that money couldn't buy, but that genuine care could earn. Maria had not only made peace with Charles's role in Maya's life, but had become his partner in designing programs that supported single-parent families. Her experience as a working mother qualified her in ways that Charles's wealth and education could not, and together they created initiatives that addressed real needs with practical solutions. The three of them, Charles, Maya, and Maria, had formed an unlikely family unit, bound not by blood or legal obligation, but by mutual care and shared purpose. They spent holidays together, celebrated birthdays and achievements together, and supported each other through difficulties and challenges. Charles had learned that love was not a finite resource that could be depleted by loss, but an infinite capacity that could expand to include new people and new purposes. Hope, the puppy Maya had rescued from the storm drain, had grown into a gentle, intelligent dog who seemed to understand his role as a therapy animal before anyone had taught him about such things. He would sit calmly beside hospital beds when Maya visited sick children through the Foundation's programs, would rest his head on the laps of elderly people who seemed lonely, would play enthusiastically with children who needed distraction from their troubles. Like his rescuer, Hope had an intuitive understanding of when and how to offer comfort. One afternoon, as Charles walked through Golden Gate Park with Maya and Hope, he reflected on the series of seemingly small events that had led to such profound change in his life. If he had walked a different route that rainy night 2 years ago, if Maya had decided not to venture out in the storm, if he had dismissed her plea for help, his life might have remained frozen in grief, his wealth might have remained merely a monument to his loneliness. Instead, he had learned something that all his business education and investment experience had never taught him, that true wealth was measured not in dollars or assets, but in connections and purpose. That real security came not from financial portfolios, but from knowing that his life mattered to people he cared about. That genuine happiness was not something that could be purchased or earned, but something that grew naturally from love and service. "Charles," Maya said, breaking into his reflections, "do you think, when we die, we get to see all the people we helped? Like, do you think your wife knows about the Foundation and all the families we've helped?" The question touched the deepest part of Charles's transformed faith. He had never returned to formal religion, but his relationship with Maya had taught him to believe in forces larger than himself, in purposes that transcended individual ambition, in the possibility that love could continue even after death. "I think," Charles said carefully, "that when we love people and try to help them, we honor everyone who ever loved us. So yes, I think Marianne knows. I think she's proud of the man I've become, and I think she's grateful that you taught me how to live again." Maya nodded solemnly, accepting his answer with the same seriousness she brought to all matters of the heart. "Good," she said, "because I think she sent me to find you that night. I think maybe sometimes God uses children to be angels for adults who forget how to hope." As they walked home together, Charles to his penthouse that now felt like a real home, Maya and Hope to their apartment that remained small but was rich with love, Charles marveled at the complex miracle of their friendship. A little girl with no money but infinite wisdom had taught a wealthy man about the true nature of treasure. A grieving widower had learned to love again through caring for a child who wasn't his, but who had chosen him anyway. A puppy rescued from certain death had become a symbol of how small acts of kindness could ripple outward to change entire communities. The rain that had brought them together had been relentless and cold, but it had washed away the barriers between their different worlds and revealed the common humanity that connected them. Charles understood now that some storms came not to destroy, but to clear the ground for new growth, not to punish, but to prepare the soil for miracles that took root slowly and grew strong over time. Years passed, and Charles aged with the kind of grace that comes from a life lived with purpose and surrounded by love. His hair silvered and lines appeared around his eyes, but they were laugh lines now, evidence of joy rediscovered and shared. His wealth continued to grow, but he measured his fortune by different standards. By the number of children who received medical care through his foundation, by the families who avoided eviction through emergency assistance programs, by the scholarships that allowed promising students to pursue dreams they couldn't have afforded on their own. Maya grew into a teenager with the same wisdom and compassion that had characterized her childhood, but with the added strength that came from knowing she was loved unconditionally by people who would support her dreams regardless of what they cost or where they led. She spoke often about becoming a doctor, inspired by the healthcare programs she had helped design for the foundation, but Charles knew that whatever path she chose would be guided by her innate desire to help others. On quiet evenings, when the three of them sat together in Charles's penthouse, now filled with Maya's artwork, Hope's toys, and Maria's cooking smells, Charles would sometimes look at the drawing Maya had made in the hospital all those years ago. The picture of him and Marianne, smiling together in golden light, remained one of his most treasured possessions, but he no longer saw it as a memorial to something he had lost. Instead, he saw it as prophecy fulfilled, a promise that love could survive death, that happiness was still possible, that Marianne's hope for his future had been realized through the unlikely friendship of a small girl with the heart of an angel. The storm drains of San Francisco still carried away the city's rainwater, but Charles never passed one without remembering that sometimes the most important rescues happened when we stopped to listen for cries no one else could hear. Sometimes salvation came in small packages, delivered by unlikely messengers, arriving at moments when we least expected hope, but most desperately needed it. On his 70th birthday, Charles sat on a bench in Golden Gate Park, his face gentle and eyes reflecting the same light that had once shone from Maya's. The years had been kind to him, not because they had been easy, but because they had been filled with purpose and love. The foundation he had started in Marianne's memory had grown into a legacy that would continue long after he was gone, ensuring that the lessons Maya had taught him about compassion and service would impact generations of families yet to come. As he watched children play on the playground nearby, their laughter mixing with the sounds of the city he had learned to love again, Charles reflected on the mysterious ways that healing could come to broken hearts. He had thought his life ended when Marianne died, but Maya had taught him that death was not an ending, but a transformation, not a closing, but an opening to new forms of love and service. A young mother pushing a stroller paused beside his bench, her child pointing excitedly at Hope, who was now an elderly dog but still possessed of the gentle spirit that had made him a perfect therapy companion. "Beautiful dog," the woman said. "He looks like he has a story." Charles smiled, his weathered hands gentle on Hope's graying fur. "He does have a story," he said. "We all do. Sometimes the most beautiful stories are about the people who save us when we don't even know we need saving." And as the afternoon sunshine filtered through the trees of Golden Gate Park, casting patterns of light and shadow on the path where so many stories converged and transformed, Charles whispered a quiet thank you to whatever force had brought a little girl to his storm drain on that rainy night so many years ago. She had taught him that miracles were real, that love was stronger than death, that wealth meant nothing without connection, and that sometimes God really did wear the face of a child. But the story of Charles and Maya didn't end with that quiet moment of gratitude. Life, Charles had learned, was not a narrative with clean conclusions, but an ongoing symphony of connections, challenges, and growth. As Maya entered her senior year of high school, their relationship faced new tests and transitions that would prove the depth of the bonds they had forged. Maya's college acceptance letters began arriving in the spring, and with them came possibilities that both thrilled and frightened Charles. Stanford had offered her a full scholarship for pre-medical studies, recognizing not just her academic excellence but her extensive volunteer work with the foundation. Harvard, Yale, and Johns Hopkins had extended similar offers. The little girl who had once counted pennies for dollar store candy now had her choice of the most prestigious universities in the country. "I could stay in San Francisco," Maya said one evening as they reviewed her options together. "UCSF has an excellent medical program, and I could continue working with the foundation. I wouldn't have to leave you and Mama." Charles felt his heart constrict at her words, recognizing the conflict between his desire to keep her close and his knowledge that she deserved to explore every opportunity. This was the moment Maria had warned him about years ago, the point where his role in Maya's life would require him to put her needs above his own emotional attachments. "Maya," Charles said gently, "what do you want to do? Not what you think we want, not what seems easiest, but what calls to your heart." Maya was quiet for a long moment, her now 18-year-old face showing the same serious concentration she had brought to every important question since childhood. "I want to learn everything I can about helping people. I want to study with the best doctors and researchers in the world. I want to come back someday and build something even better than what we have now." "Then that's what you should do," Charles said, though the words felt like they were being pulled from the depths of his soul. "Distance doesn't break the bonds that matter, Maya. Love isn't diminished by miles." The months leading up to Maya's departure for Harvard were bittersweet. Charles threw himself into documenting everything she had contributed to the foundation, ensuring that her insights and approaches would continue to guide their work in her absence. Together they created detailed protocols for the youth mentorship programs, family support initiatives, and emergency assistance funds that bore the mark of her wisdom. Maya, for her part, seemed determined to create lasting memories with her chosen family. She organized elaborate dinner parties in Charles's penthouse, teaching Maria how to use the professional-grade kitchen so they could host the neighbors, teachers, and friends who had become their extended community. She trained Hope to perform new tricks, as if preparing him for the loneliness her absence might bring. She filled sketchbooks with drawings of their favorite places around the city, creating visual memories of their shared adventures. The night before Maya left for Boston, Charles found himself standing once again on California Street, near the storm drain where their story had begun. The rain was falling gently, not with the fierce intensity of that night a decade earlier, but with the soft persistence of nature's renewal. Maya appeared beside him as if summoned by his thoughts, Hope trotting loyally at her side despite his advanced age. "Are you having second thoughts?" Charles asked, noting the contemplative expression on her face. "Not about leaving," Maya said, "but about whether I've taught you everything you need to know about taking care of yourself while I'm gone." Charles laughed, a sound of pure affection. "I think you've got that backwards, young lady. You're the one heading off into a new world. But you're the one who has to remember how to keep living when someone you love goes away," Maya said, her words carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I know it's different this time. I'm not dying, just moving. But I also know how your heart works now. I know you might be tempted to stop the clocks again." The observation hit Charles with the force of absolute truth. He had been so focused on supporting Maya's transition that he hadn't fully processed his own feelings about her departure. The fear was there, lurking beneath his encouragement and pride. The fear of returning to that empty penthouse, of losing the daily purpose that her presence had provided, of sliding back into the gray landscape of his grief. "Promise me something," Maya said, taking his hand as she had that first night when she was 8 years old and he was drowning in sorrow. "Promise me you'll keep the clocks running. Promise me you'll keep helping kids who need saving. Promise me that if you start feeling lost, you'll go find someone else who needs finding." "I promise," Charles said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "But you have to promise me something too. Promise me you'll remember that being far away doesn't mean you're alone. Promise me you'll call when you need encouragement, or advice, or just someone who believes in you completely." "I promise," Maya said, and sealed it with a hug that felt like both goodbye and beginning. The first few months after Maya's departure were harder than Charles had anticipated. The penthouse, despite being filled with her artwork and memories, felt cavernously empty without her daily presence. Maria continued to visit regularly, and they maintained their partnership in running the foundation, but there was an undeniable void where Maya's unique perspective had been. Charles found himself walking past Maya's old school, lingering in Washington Square Park, where she used to feed pigeons, stopping by the children's hospital where she had volunteered. These pilgrimages to the geography of their shared life helped him process the complex emotions of loving someone enough to let them go. But it was Hope who provided the most unexpected comfort during this transition. The elderly dog seemed to understand that his role as emotional support animal had evolved, and he began exhibiting behaviors Charles had never seen before. Hope would nudge Charles toward his computer when it was time to write his weekly email to Maya. He would bring Charles his shoes when it was time for their walk to the foundation offices. Most remarkably, Hope began approaching other people who seemed lost or lonely, offering the same intuitive comfort he had once provided exclusively to Charles's family. One afternoon in early December, as Charles was walking Hope through the Tenderloin neighborhood where Maya had grown up, the dog suddenly pulled toward a small figure huddled in the doorway of a closed store. A boy no more than 10 years old sat with his arms wrapped around his knees, his eyes holding the same mixture of fear and determination that Charles remembered from Maya's face all those years ago. "Are you okay, son?" Charles asked, kneeling down to the boy's level, as Hope settled calmly beside him. "I'm fine," the boy said too quickly, "just waiting for someone." Charles recognized the lie, but also the pride beneath it. This was a child who had learned to be cautious around adults, who had developed survival strategies that included deception and self-reliance. Charles saw himself reflected in the boy's wariness, the way he had once dismissed Maya's request for help, assuming he knew better than to believe in the impossible. "What's your name?" Charles asked gently. "Diego," the boy said, his eyes never leaving Hope, who had somehow positioned himself between Diego and the street, as if creating a safe space for conversation. "I'm Charles and this is Hope. We were just heading to get some hot chocolate. Would you like to join us?" The offer was simple, requiring nothing from Diego except the willingness to accept kindness from a stranger. Charles watched the boy's internal debate, wariness battling against need, fear competing with the basic human desire for warmth and connection. "I don't have any money," Diego said finally. "That's okay," Charles replied. "Sometimes people buy us things too. That's how kindness works. It goes around in circles." As they sat in a small cafe, Diego wrapped his hands around a steaming mug of hot chocolate and began to tell his story in pieces. His mother worked multiple jobs, but was struggling with medical bills after a car accident. Their apartment was in transition. A euphemism Charles recognized meant they were facing eviction. Diego had been spending his afternoons on the street rather than going home because he didn't want to add to his mother's stress by being another mouth to feed or another worry to carry. Charles listened with the attention Maya had taught him to give to children's stories, hearing not just the surface facts but the deeper currents of fear, loyalty, and premature responsibility. In Diego's careful recounting of his family's struggles, Charles heard echoes of Maya's own childhood. The way poverty could make children grow up too fast. The way love could persist even when resources ran short. "Diego," Charles said when the boy finished talking. "Would you like to help me with something? I run a foundation that helps families who are going through tough times, and I could use someone who understands what kids really need when they're scared." The boy's eyes widened. "You mean like a job?" "More like a partnership," Charles said. "You help me understand how to help families like yours, and we help your family get back on stable ground. Fair trade?" That afternoon marked the beginning of Charles's second major life transformation. Working with Diego, he rediscovered the sense of purpose that Maya's departure had temporarily obscured. But more than that, he began to understand what Maya had meant when she promised him that if he felt lost, he should find someone else who needed finding. Diego's situation led Charles to expand the foundation's work in new directions. They created after-school programs for children whose parents worked evening shifts, emergency housing assistance for families facing eviction, job training, and placement services for adults struggling with unemployment or underemployment. Each new program was designed with input from the people it was meant to serve, following the model Maya had established of really listening to communities rather than imposing solutions from outside. Within 6 months, Diego's family was stable again. His mother had received both medical debt assistance and job training that led to better employment, and they had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood. But Diego continued to work with Charles, helping to identify other families in crisis and serving as a bridge between the foundation and the communities it served. Charles began to understand that Maya hadn't just saved him from drowning in his grief. She had taught him a way of being in the world that could be replicated and extended. The key was learning to see children not as problems to be solved or recipients of charity, but as partners in creating solutions, as sources of wisdom about what families actually needed to thrive. Over the course of Maya's college years, Charles's life developed new rhythms and purposes. His weekly phone calls with Maya became treasured conversations where she shared her academic discoveries and he shared stories about the Foundation's evolving programs. She was flourishing at Harvard, her natural empathy and intelligence making her a standout in her pre-medical courses, but she remained grounded in the values that had defined her childhood. "I met a professor who reminds me of you," Maya told him during one of their calls. "Dr. Williams runs a clinic in Boston that serves homeless families. She says the best medicine happens when doctors remember that they're treating people, not just symptoms." "Sounds like someone you should learn from," Charles replied, recognizing in Maya's description the same integration of professional skill and personal compassion that had always characterized her approach to helping others. "I am," Maya said. "I'm volunteering at her clinic, and I'm thinking about doing my senior thesis on how childhood trauma affects long-term health outcomes. Dr. Williams says there's a lot of research showing that kids who experience chronic stress, from poverty, family instability, stuff like that, have higher rates of heart disease, diabetes, and mental health problems later in life." Charles felt a chill of recognition. "Like Diego and the other kids we work with?" "Exactly," Maya said. "But here's the thing. The research also shows that having even one stable, caring adult relationship can completely change those outcomes. One person who believes in a child, who shows up consistently, who helps them feel safe and valued, that can literally change the trajectory of their entire life." The conversation stayed with Charles long after they hung up. He thought about his own life, about how Maya's presence had changed his trajectory from despair toward purpose. He thought about Diego, whose academic performance had improved dramatically since joining the Foundation family, who had gone from a scared boy hiding in doorways to a confident teenager applying to colleges. But most of all, he thought about Marianne and what she would make of the man he had become. The Charles she had married had been successful, but self-absorbed, wealthy but disconnected from the broader human community. The Charles who now spent his days working to solve other people's problems, who measured success in terms of children's smiles and families' stability, was someone she would barely have recognized, and yet someone she would have loved completely. As Maya's graduation approached, Charles found himself planning not just her celebration, but his own next chapter. At 75, he was in good health and possessed of energy that seemed to increase rather than diminish as he found new ways to channel his resources toward meaningful work. The foundation had grown into one of the most effective poverty-fighting organizations on the West Coast, but Charles knew there was still more work to be done. Maya returned home for her graduation ceremony looking like a young woman who had found her calling. She moved with the confident purpose of someone who knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life, but she also retained the gentle wisdom that had characterized her since childhood. She spent her first week home, visiting all their old haunts, feeding pigeons in Washington Square Park, reading to children at the library, helping Maria serve breakfast at Rosa's Diner, which had grown into a small chain of community-oriented restaurants. "So what's the plan?" Charles asked her one evening as they sat on his terrace, watching the sunset paint the bay in familiar shades of gold and pink. "Medical school at UCSF," Maya said without hesitation. "I want to specialize in pediatrics, with a focus on community health. And I want to keep working with the foundation, developing programs that address the root causes of the health problems we see in kids from low-income families." Charles smiled. "Sounds like you've got it all figured out." "Not all of it," Maya said. "I want to expand what we're doing, Charles. I want to create a model that other cities can replicate. I want to build a network of community-based programs that prove healthcare and social services work better when they're designed by the people who need them." The vision Maya outlined was ambitious. Family resource centers that would combine medical care, educational support, job training, and emergency assistance under one roof, staffed by professionals who came from and understood the communities they served. It would require significant funding, complex partnerships, and years of careful development. "It sounds expensive," Charles said, though his tone suggested interest rather than concern. "It would be," Maya agreed, "but think about the cost of not doing it. The emergency room visits we could prevent, the educational failures we could avoid, the family breakups we could stop before they happen. I think we could show that investing in communities actually saves money in the long run." Charles looked at this remarkable young woman who had grown from the 8-year-old girl who rescued puppies from storm drains into someone capable of reimagining entire systems of care. "Tell me more," he said. They spent that summer developing what would become known as the Maya model, an integrated approach to community health that treated families as complete systems rather than collections of individual problems. Charles provided the financial resources and business expertise, Maya provided the vision and community connections, and together they created something neither could have accomplished alone. The first Maya Model Center opened in the Tenderloin 3 years after Maya graduated from college, in a renovated building that had once housed a check-cashing store and a pawn shop. The space included a community health clinic staffed by doctors and nurses who specialized in family medicine, a computer lab where children could do homework, and adults could access job training programs, a commercial kitchen where nutrition classes were taught and healthy meals were prepared for pickup by working families, and a series of meeting rooms where support groups, counseling sessions, and community meetings could take place. But the most innovative feature of the center was its governance structure. Rather than being run by outside administrators, the Maya Model Centers were governed by councils that included residents of the communities they served. Families who had been helped by the programs took on leadership roles, helping to design new services and evaluate the effectiveness of existing ones. Diego, now a sophomore at UC Berkeley studying social work, served on the first community council, bringing the perspective of someone who had lived through family crisis and emerged stronger. Maria had become the center's director of family services, using her experience as a single mother to help other parents navigate challenges ranging from housing insecurity to health care access. Charles watched these developments with wonder and pride, marveling at how his fortune had been transformed from a burden of meaningless luxury into a tool for systematic change. The foundation now operated 15 Maya Model Centers across California, with plans for expansion into other states. The programs had been studied and replicated by universities, featured in medical journals, and cited as model approaches by policymakers. But for Charles, the real measure of success remained personal and immediate. It was the look on a child's face when they mastered a new skill in the computer lab. It was the relief in a mother's voice when she called to say she had found stable employment through the job training program. It was the gradual transformation of neighborhoods as families gained stability and began investing in their communities. On Maya's 30th birthday, as they sat together in the same penthouse where she had once curled up in Mary Ann's chair to read, Charles reflected on the unexpected trajectory of his life. He had begun as a man who measured everything in terms of profit and loss, accumulation and scarcity. Maya had taught him a different mathematics, one where giving multiplied rather than diminished wealth, where investing in other people's success generated returns that couldn't be calculated on any balance sheet. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found each other that night?" Maya asked, as if she could read his thoughts. Charles considered the question seriously. "I think I would have died," he said finally. "Maybe not physically, at least not right away, but I would have died inside, consumed by my own grief and bitterness. I would have wasted everything Mary Ann and I had built together. And I probably would have ended up like a lot of kids from my neighborhood," Maya said. "Maybe I would have made it to college eventually, but I wouldn't have had the confidence to dream big, to believe I could change systems instead of just surviving them." "We saved each other," Charles said. "We did," Maya agreed. "But I think that's how it's supposed to work. I think we're all here to save each other in whatever ways we can." As if summoned by their conversation, Hope appeared in the doorway, now ancient in dog years but still possessed of the gentle spirit that had made him a perfect companion for their work. He settled beside Maya's chair with a contented sigh, and for a moment the three of them sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the warmth of shared history and purpose. Charles looked around his penthouse, noting how it had been transformed over the years. The expensive artwork had been joined by dozens of children's drawings from the Maya model centers. The French antique furniture coexisted with comfortable seating suitable for community meetings. The professional-grade kitchen was used regularly to test recipes for the nutrition programs and to host dinners for the Foundation's extended family of staff and volunteers. This was wealth, Charles realized, not the accumulation of things, but the cultivation of relationships, the creation of systems that helped other people flourish, the knowledge that his life had been spent in service of something larger than himself. "Maya," he said, "I want to ask you something. I'm 78 years old now, and while I'm healthy, I'm also realistic about the future. I want to make sure the Foundation will continue to grow and evolve after I'm gone. Would you consider taking over as director when you finish your medical training?" Billionaire. Maya was quiet for a long moment, and Charles could see her considering not just the practical implications of his question, but its emotional weight. She understood that he was asking her to become the keeper of his legacy, the guardian of everything they had built together. "On one condition," she said finally. "We establish the Foundation as a community-owned organization, with governance shared between professional staff and the people we serve. I don't want to be the sole authority making decisions about other people's lives. I want to be part of a collaborative leadership structure that keeps the community voice at the center of everything we do." Charles smiled. Even in accepting this massive responsibility, Maya was insisting on the principles of participatory leadership and community empowerment that had always guided their work. "Of course," he said, "I wouldn't have it any other way." The transition took place over the following 2 years, as Maya completed her medical residency and gradually assumed more leadership responsibilities within the Foundation. Charles remained involved as chairman of the board, but Maya became the public face of the Maya model and the driving force behind its continued expansion and evolution. By the time Charles reached his 80th birthday, the Maya model centers were operating in 12 states, serving over 50 zero-zero families annually. The approach had been studied and adopted by international development organizations working in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Maya had become a recognized expert in community health, speaking at conferences around the world and consulting with governments interested in replicating their model. But for Charles, the most meaningful measure of their success remained intensely local and personal. He still volunteered at the original Tenderloin Center twice a week, helping children with homework and listening to parents navigate the challenges of raising families in difficult circumstances. These interactions kept him connected to the human reality behind all the statistics and studies, reminding him daily of why their work mattered. One afternoon, as Charles was helping a 7-year-old named Sophia with her reading, he was struck by the similarity between her eager curiosity and Maya's as a child. Sophia asked endless questions, offered creative solutions to problems, and approached each new challenge with a mixture of determination and joy that reminded him of why he had first been drawn to Maya all those years ago. "Mr. Charles," Sophia said, looking up from her book, "why do you come here every day to help us?" The question was innocent but profound, touching the very heart of why Charles had restructured his entire life around service to others. He thought about all the ways he could answer. Because it was his responsibility as someone with resources, because he believed in investing in children's futures, because it was what Maya had taught him about the nature of meaningful existence. But in the end, he gave her the simplest and most truthful response. "Because you matter, Sophia. Because every child matters. And every family deserves the chance to thrive. And because helping you reminds me of who I'm supposed to be in this world." Sophia nodded solemnly, accepting his answer with the gravity children brought to important conversations. "Good," she said, "because we need you here." The words hit Charles with unexpected force. After decades of searching for purpose, of struggling to understand how to use his privilege and resources responsibly, a 7-year-old had articulated the fundamental truth he had been seeking. We need each other. Wealth without connection was meaningless. Success without service was empty. Love without action was incomplete. That evening, Charles called Maya to share the conversation with Sophia. Maya had recently returned from a conference in Geneva, where she had presented their community health model to an audience of international development experts, and Charles could hear the exhaustion and exhilaration in her voice. "Sometimes I can't believe how far we've come," Maya said. "When I think about that little girl standing in the rain begging a stranger to help save a puppy, it seems impossible that we've built something this big." "But that's exactly how we built it," Charles replied. "One person asking for help, one person deciding to listen, one relationship at a time. The scale has changed, but the foundation is still the same, people caring for each other." "Speaking of which," Maya said, "I have some news. David and I are getting married." Charles felt a burst of pure joy at the announcement. David was a fellow physician Maya had met during her residency, someone who shared her commitment to community health and her belief that medicine was most effective when it addressed social and economic factors as well as physical symptoms. Charles had watched their relationship develop with the satisfaction of someone who recognized true partnership when he saw it. "That's wonderful news," Charles said. "Have you set a date?" "Next spring," Maya said. "And, Charles, I want you to walk me down the aisle. You and Mama both. You're the closest thing to family I have, and I can't imagine getting married without you there to officially give me away." Charles felt tears prick his eyes. In all his imagining of how his life might progress after Marianne's death, he had never envisioned this moment, being asked to play the role of father in the wedding of a child who had chosen him as family. The honor felt almost too large to accept, too precious to deserve. "I would be honored beyond words," he managed to say. Maya's wedding took place in Golden Gate Park, in the same grove where she and Charles had walked together countless times over the years. The ceremony was small but diverse, including Maya's biological family, Charles's chosen family, foundation staff and volunteers, community members from the Maya Model Centers, and David's family who had welcomed Maya with open arms. Charles stood beside Maria as Maya walked toward them, radiant in a simple white dress that she had chosen because it reflected her values rather than her resources. As he took her arm to escort her down the aisle, Charles thought about all the other fathers who might have filled this role if circumstances had been different. But he also understood that the relationship he and Maya had built was not a substitute for something missing, but a unique bond that had grown from their mutual willingness to save each other. "Thank you," Maya whispered to him as they approached the altar, where David waited with a smile of pure love. "For everything. For listening that first night. For staying with me in the hospital. For teaching me that wealth is only valuable if it's shared. For showing me that family is something we choose as much as something we inherit." "Thank you," Charles replied, "for teaching me how to live." The years that followed Maya's wedding brought new dimensions to Charles's understanding of family and legacy. Maya and David's first child, a daughter they named Esperanza, hope in Spanish, was born on a crisp October morning 2 years after their wedding. When Charles held his honorary granddaughter for the first time, feeling her tiny fingers curl around his weathered hand, he understood that love was indeed infinite, that his capacity for caring had only grown deeper with age and experience. Esperanza grew up surrounded by the extended family of the Foundation community, equally comfortable playing in Charles's penthouse and helping her mother sort supplies at the Maya Model Centers. Like her mother before her, she showed an early aptitude for connecting with people across age and cultural differences, displaying an intuitive understanding of when someone needed comfort or encouragement. "She has your gift," Charles told Maya one afternoon as they watched 3-year-old Esperanza coax a shy child to join a group playing in the center's courtyard. "She has love," Maya replied. "Same as you, same as me, same as everyone. The gift isn't having it, it's knowing how to share it." Mini. As Charles entered his mid-80s, his role evolved from active leadership to elder statesmanship. Maya had fully assumed control of the Foundation's operations, expanding the Maya model into international markets while maintaining the community-centered principles that had always guided their work. Charles served as a consultant and advisor. His business experience and institutional memory valuable resources for navigating complex challenges. But his most meaningful contribution continued to be his presence at the original Tenderloin Center, where children who had never known a world without the Maya model took for granted that a kind elderly man would be available to help with homework, listen to problems, and offer encouragement when life became difficult. To them, Charles was not a philanthropist or a business mogul, but simply Mr. Charles, someone reliable, caring, and consistently available to help. Diego, now a licensed social worker with a master's degree from Berkeley, had become the director of youth programs for all Maya Model Centers. His journey from scared child hiding in doorways to confident professional leading system change served as inspiration for countless other young people who participated in the Foundation's programs. Diego often spoke at fundraising events about the transformative power of being seen and valued by adults who believed in children's potential. "Mr. Charles saved my life," Diego would tell audiences, "not by giving me money or solving my problems, but by treating me like someone whose ideas mattered, whose experiences had value, whose future was worth investing in." That's what the Maya model is really about, recognizing that every person has gifts to offer and creating systems that help those gifts flourish. Charles would listen to these speeches with wonder at how his simple decision to help Maya rescue a puppy had rippled outward to influence thousands of lives across multiple generations. The butterfly effect of kindness, he had learned, was real and measurable. Small actions, motivated by genuine care, could indeed change the world. On his 85th birthday, Charles made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. At a party held at the Tenderloin Center, surrounded by several hundred people whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work, he announced his intention to give away the remainder of his personal fortune. "I've spent the last 25 years learning what wealth really means," he told the assembled crowd. "It's not about accumulation, it's about circulation. Money sitting in accounts, earning interest, isn't helping anyone. Money invested in education, healthcare, housing, and opportunity, that's money fulfilling its purpose. The Charles Whitman Endowment, established with a gift of $800 million, was designed to ensure the Maya model's sustainability and continued expansion for generations to come. The endowment's governance structure reflected Maya's commitment to community leadership, with boards that included both professional experts and people who had been served by the programs. Charles kept only enough personal wealth to maintain his modest lifestyle and cover his basic needs. The penthouse, which had once symbolized his isolation and excess, was donated to the foundation and converted into transitional housing for families moving from crisis toward stability. Charles moved to a small apartment near the original Maya Model Center, where he could walk to his volunteer activities and remain closely connected to the community that had given his life meaning. Maya initially protested the dramatic downsizing of his living situation, worried about his comfort and safety. But Charles found deep satisfaction in the simplicity of his new life. His apartment was just large enough for his needs, furnished with comfortable rather than luxurious pieces, filled with photographs and artwork that represented relationships rather than investments. "I'm not poor," he explained to Maya when she expressed concern. "I'm rich in all the ways that matter. I have meaningful work, people I love, and the knowledge that my life has been spent serving something larger than myself. What more could I possibly need?" Hope, now nearly 16 years old and showing his age in every movement, adapted to their new living situation with the same grace he had shown throughout their adventures together. The elderly dog spent most of his time sleeping in the sunny corner of Charles's living room, but he still accompanied Charles to the center several times a week, providing gentle comfort to families navigating difficult transitions. Children at the center had grown up seeing Charles and Hope as a unit, and they understood instinctively that the dog's presence meant safety, patience, and unconditional acceptance. When Hope finally passed away peacefully in his sleep on a warm spring morning, the entire Maya model community mourned his passing and celebrated his legacy. The memorial service for Hope was held in the center's courtyard, attended by hundreds of children and families who had been touched by his gentle presence. Maya spoke about the way Hope had embodied the foundation's values: listening without judgment, offering comfort without conditions, staying present through difficult times. "Hope taught us that healing happens in relationships," Maya said. "He showed us that sometimes the most powerful medicine is simply knowing that someone cares enough to stay with you, to sit quietly beside you when words aren't enough, to offer their presence as a gift." Charles, sitting in the front row with Esperanza on his lap and surrounded by the extended family of the foundation community, felt the completeness of Hope's life and legacy. The puppy Maya had rescued from certain death in a storm drain had lived to see thousands of children rescued from poverty, neglect, and despair. Hope had been present for Maya's graduation from college and medical school, her wedding, the birth of her daughter, and the creation of a model of community care that was changing lives around the world. At 87, Charles continued his volunteer work at the center with the determination of someone who understood that purpose was the best medicine for aging. His body was slower than it had been, his energy more carefully managed, but his mind remained sharp and his commitment to the community unwavering. New children arrived at the center regularly, many of them facing circumstances similar to those Maya and Diego had navigated in their youth. Charles found deep satisfaction in being part of their support system, offering the steady presence of an adult who believed in their potential and was willing to invest time in their growth. One afternoon, as Charles was helping a 9-year-old named Marcus with a science project about ecosystems, the boy asked him a question that brought their entire conversation full circle. "Mr. Charles, how do you know when you've helped someone enough? Like, when is a person fixed?" Charles set down the materials they had been working with and gave Marcus the same serious attention Maya had taught him to offer when children asked important questions. "People aren't broken things that need to be fixed, Marcus," he said gently. "People are growing things that need to be nurtured. The help never stops because the growing never stops. We keep caring for each other because that's how communities stay healthy, how families get stronger, How children become adults who know how to care for the next group of children. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. So it's like the nitrogen cycle we're studying. The nutrients go around and around, feeding different plants and animals, and nothing gets wasted? Exactly like that, Charles said, marveling once again at a child's ability to see complex truths simply. Kindness is like nitrogen in the soil of community. It gets used by one person to grow strong, and then they share it with someone else who needs it, and it keeps cycling through the whole system, making everything more healthy. That evening, Charles called Maya to share his conversation with Marcus, finding in the boy's ecological metaphor a perfect description of what they had built together. The Maya model had become a functioning ecosystem, with resources, care, and opportunity circulating through interconnected communities, creating conditions where children and families could thrive. We've created something sustainable, Maya marveled, not just financially, but emotionally and socially. The people we've helped are now helping others. The children we've mentored are becoming mentors themselves. It's regenerative. Charles smiled. Your mother would be proud of both of us, he said, referring to Maria, who had passed away 2 years earlier after a brief illness. In her final weeks, Maria had expressed satisfaction at seeing Maya grown into a confident leader and Charles transformed from an isolated wealthy man into the heart of a caring community. She would, Maya agreed. She always said the best investment we could make was in each other. She proved it by investing in me, you proved it by investing in all of us, and now we get to keep proving it with every child we help believe in their own worth. As Charles approached his 90th birthday, he began to feel the weight of his years in ways that couldn't be ignored. His energy was more limited, his mobility more restricted, but his sense of purpose remained as strong as ever. Rather than retreat from his commitments, he adapted his role to match his capabilities, focusing on the kinds of contributions only he could make. He began recording oral histories of the Foundation's development, sitting with Maya and Diego and other longtime community members to document not just what they had accomplished, but how they had learned to do the work. These recordings would serve as training materials for future staff and volunteers, preserving the institutional knowledge and wisdom that had emerged from decades of trial, error, and refinement. Charles also began writing letters to Esperanza, now 8 years old, and showing signs of the same intuitive compassion that had characterized her mother. The letters were meant to be opened when she reached adulthood, a grandfather's wisdom preserved for the granddaughter who might someday need guidance about how to use privilege and resources responsibly. My dear Esperanza, he wrote in one letter, by the time you read this, I will probably be gone. But the love I have for you and the lessons I've learned about what makes life meaningful will live on in the work we've built together. Remember that wealth is not about what you accumulate, but what you circulate. Remember that power is not about what you can control, but what you can contribute. Remember that success is not about rising above others, but about lifting others up alongside you. On a crisp autumn morning, as Charles was walking slowly to the Maya Model Center for his regular volunteer shift, he felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The sensation was not painful exactly, but it carried the unmistakable weight of significance. Charles found a bench in the small park where he and Maya had fed pigeons together all those years ago, and sat quietly, breathing carefully and watching the morning light filter through the trees. Diego, arriving early for a staff meeting, spotted Charles on the bench and immediately recognized that something was different. Without alarming anyone else, he called Maya and then sat beside Charles, offering the same quiet presence that hope had once provided. I think it's time, Charles said simply, his voice calm and accepting. Maya arrived within minutes, bringing Esperanza with her because she had been planning to visit after school, and there hadn't been time to arrange other care. The 3 generations sat together on the bench, surrounded by the sounds of the city waking up and the sight of children walking to school. Are you afraid? Maya asked, taking Charles's hand as she had that first night when she was 8 years old, and he was drowning in grief. No, Charles said, and he realized with some surprise that it was true. I'm grateful for my time with Marianne, for the years you've given me, for getting to be part of Esperanza's childhood, for getting to see what we've built together. I'm grateful for a life that became worth living. Esperanza, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding its implications, leaned against Charles's side and said, "I love you, Abuelo Charles." The use of the Spanish word for grandfather, which Esperanza had started calling him naturally and without prompting, filled Charles with warmth. He had never expected to be anyone's grandfather, had mourned the children he and Marianne had never had. But here was this beautiful child claiming him as family in the most fundamental way. "I love you too, mija," Charles said, using the Spanish term of endearment Maya had taught him. Take care of each other, and remember that sometimes God wears the face of a child, and sometimes the best way to honor the people we've lost is to love the people we still have. Charles Whitman died peacefully that afternoon, surrounded by the family he had chosen and been chosen by. His funeral was held at the Maya Model Center, attended by thousands of people whose lives had been touched by his transformation from isolated millionaire to beloved community elder. Maya spoke at the service about the night a lost man and a determined little girl had rescued each other from different kinds of storms. She talked about how Charles had taught her that wealth without compassion was poverty, that success without service was failure, that love required action to become meaningful. Diego spoke about how Charles had shown him that survival was not enough, that every child deserved to thrive, that caring adults could change the trajectory of young people's entire lives through patience, attention, and unwavering belief in their potential. But it was Esperanza, standing on a small platform so everyone could see her, who delivered the most memorable tribute. Abuelo Charles taught me that when you help someone small who needs saving, you save yourself too. He taught me that the richest people are the ones who give the most away. He taught me that love is something that grows bigger the more you share it. And he taught me that sometimes when someone we love has to go away, they leave seeds behind that keep growing into more love. The Maya model continued to expand after Charles's death, guided by the principles he and Maya had developed and the endowment he had created. New centers opened regularly, each one adapted to the specific needs of its community, but grounded in the same commitment to participatory leadership and holistic family support. Maya completed her medical training and became the Foundation's first chief medical officer.